is the cheshach, kafel, and makufel, which the Rebbe would talk about all the time, that the darkness of exile before Mashiach comes is the cheshach, kafel, and makufel, which means doubled and redoubled darkness. Kufel is the same word as couple. It's literally the same word. Kafel and makufel means doubled and redoubled. And the Baal Shem Tov would explain what's this interesting phrase. I've actually seen it translated into English as a fourfold darkness. Someone took it very literal, right? They saw double, and then they saw it so doubled again. So they said 2 times 2 is 4. So it must mean in English we'll translate it as a fourfold darkness. But I don't know if that's really the intention. The famous teaching is of the Baal Shem Tov, I believe attributed to the Baal Shem Tov, that the Baal Shem Tov said that the doubled and redoubled darkness means that the darkness itself is covered over, right? That's what it means, doubled and redoubled. In other words, it's so dark that you don't even realize how dark it is. Like you're so blind that you don't even realize you're blind. It's like a famous story of the Maggid of Mezrich, the Baal Shem Tov's Talmud, right? The famous story that the child was crying, and the Maggid asked the child, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "Because we were playing hide and seek, and I hid so well that everyone searched for a little while, but then they forgot about me, and they left me, and they won't play with me anymore because I hid myself so well, and they never found me." Right? And the Maggid said that Hashem is the exact same way. That God, this is the whole point of life, is a game of hide and seek. Hashem is hiding, and you're supposed to find Him, right? But unfortunately, we're so lost at such difficult times that a lot of people have forgotten they're even playing the game, right? It's like Hashem's like the child on the playground. Everybody forgot. Everybody gave up. Everybody gets. Very good question. He has a lot of patience, right? It's like the kid who has a lot of patience. He's more like the Japanese soldier, right? The famous story of the Japanese soldier after World War II on some island in the Pacific, where they could, for like 20 years after the war, he still thought there was a war, right? He wouldn't let anyone tell him otherwise. It's more like that. And that's the metaphor. Anyway, all of that because of two-factor authentication. So we got on this topic. Anyway, doubled and redoubled. Two-factor of the two-factor authentication. Anyway, we are in the middle of the 3rd chapter of the Holy Tanya. We are, what I'd really like to do is make this the second to last class on chapter 3. We'll finish next week, God willing. Chapter 3, and move on to chapter 4. That's my plan. And most of the rest of chapter 3 is a lot of things that we've already discussed in class outside of the text, so we're just going to read it inside. So in terms of words, there's a lot of chapter 3 left, but in terms of concepts, we've already spoken about a lot of what the rest of chapter 3 talks about. So we're speaking about chapter 3, of course, is about the 10 faculties of the godly soul, right? Chapter 2 tells us what is the godly soul, the etzem. What is it at its core? It's literally a piece of God above. That's what the godly soul is, the godly soul of a Jew. And then we say, but what is that, right? What does it mean it's a piece of God above? And when we say what is that in this world, in Elam Hazeh, when we say what is that, we mean what type of thing is it, right? What distinguishes it from everything else? Which means I have to know something about it, right? If I say, what is this cup? And you tell me, well, this cup is a piece of God. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't understand what it is, right? My reply would be, my friend, that means there is no cup. That means the thing doesn't exist, right? Existing in this world, existing in our terms, means existing externally, existing in interaction, right? There's some way that the thing can be known in the broadest sense of definition, and that's really what it means, even that it exists, right? In terms of worldly philosophy, right, you have the famous question, sort of like if a tree falls in the middle of a forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound, right? But even more radical than that, you could say, if there's something that can't even in principle be known at all in any way, it can't be perceived by the senses, it can't be understood, no one can ever know that it's there, it's a question philosophically whether you can even really say that it exists, right? Existence and being knowable in some way, at least in the understanding of Elam Hazeh, the two things really go together, right? When you say the godly soul, the point I'm making is that when you say the godly soul is literally a piece of God above, as we said in chapter 2, right? Or you could even be more poetic, and you could say that It is that as the Alter Rebbe said, that it's the thing that's farkacht, it's the thing that's inflamed, that its obsession is that God is klar faran and everything else is klar nicht faran, that God exists and everything else does not exist, and that's its obsession, right? But the question remains, what is an obsession? Right? You're describing something very abstract, and you're trying to tell me that the obsession is the thing itself, right? It's very interesting because in normally when we would talk about an obsession, you would say that an obsession can only exist when there's someone to obsess, right? Here, the way the Alter Rebbe famously in the quote describes the godly soul is that no, what it is the obsession, right? It's not. There's no deeper level. It's not something that has an obsession. Right? What it is a motion, it's a bren, it's a fire, it's a passion, and a passion only for God. That God is all that exists and everything else clearly doesn't exist. And it is this passion, right? And all of this is very poetic and very abstract. The question remains, okay, but meat and potatoes, like what is this thing? What we really mean by that is a lower level of what is this thing. We mean, I'm not asking what its definition is as God creates it. I'm asking what is it the same way I'd ask about my cup, what is it? Which means, how is it known? What's its interaction? How does it interact with other things, right? Things that are not itself. And the answer is, what it is in that definition is seichel and midos. What it is in that definition is mind and emotions, which can be divided up into 10 independent faculties. And that's what the godly soul is. The godly soul is a mind, and the godly soul is emotions. And those are the two things that it is. The mind explains how the godly soul relates to things that are not itself, that are above it, or that are within it, that are deeper in it, how it relates to its source, if you will. Whereas the emotions are how the godly soul relates to things that are outside of itself, beyond itself, transcending itself. Pardon me, outside, not transcending. Outside of itself, beyond itself, the external world, an external relation. That's generally what chapter 3 is about. Last week, what we discussed, moving on to a review of what we did last time. Last time, most of the class was really about the difference between Chachma and Bina. That's really what we discussed a lot. We're explaining how the intellect gives birth to the emotions, right? You have two different functions, as we've been explaining as we've been going through the chapter and elaborating on more and more, right? Intellect and emotions are the two primary functions. You can divide them up into the sub-faculties and all of that, right? But at the broadest sense, you have the 3 intellectual and the 7 emotional faculties, right? And in a way, they're kind of like opposites, as I just said, because the whole function of the intellectual faculty is the soul's self-construction. That's really what it is, right? The soul builds its own personality. It creates its own personality. How? Through the intellect, through the ability to behold and attach and have an awareness and a cognizance of other things. The intellect creates the soul. The intellect is the soul, is the godly soul working on itself. It's creating a self, right? In other words, as I hope has been clear throughout the classes, right? The real self of the Nefesh Elokis is not discussed in chapter 3. We already discussed it in chapter 2. The real self is the fact that is the spark of God, is the fact that the godly soul is literally a piece of God above. When we're talking about the self in chapter 3, right, when we're talking about how the intellect and the mind is how the soul builds itself, right? Whereas the emotions are how that self then relates to other selves, right? Relates to others. The self of the godly soul that we're discussing in this context, right? We're discussing the finite self, right? We're discussing, in other words, you can even maybe think of it a little bit like this. You could think of it as, a person in their life wears a lot of different hats. A person at work has to be one person, so to speak. A person with their small children has to be a different person. A person who's shopping in the grocery store may have to be yet a third person, right? Not the same person in every context. The person puts on and takes off different hats. They put on and take off different, garments, ways, different ways of being. Now, as we're going to see in chapter 4, there are some garments which are very ephemeral, right? Which are really changed from second to second. They have no real sticking power, right? Those, it's not even right to talk about them as the self in any way, because, like, for example, my thought, speech, and action, right? My thought, speech, and action, these are things that are so ephemeral, that are so superficial, that I can literally change them at a moment's notice, and there'd be no sign even that the other one was there a second ago. It's not really a self-transformation, right? The intellect and the emotions are interesting because they're a little bit of one, a little bit of the other, what we're discussing in this chapter. On the one hand, the intellect and the emotions are also garments. They're also ways of relating. They're not the unchanging essence of the soul. The essence of the soul is literally a piece of God, and it changes as much as God does, which means it doesn't change at all, right? It's a transcended self. It comes from God. It doesn't change. It doesn't grow. It doesn't transform, and that's its deepest and most profound identity. The most profound identity of the godly soul, right? When it's naked, so to speak, when you take all garments off, all selves off, all means of relating off, what is it? It's a piece of God. Right? Yes.
So you got all these different things. You have a piece of God. Now there's multiple pieces of God. Can you not change from one piece to another piece?
You're saying because there's multiple people?
No, within a single person.
No. That's not what I meant to say. If that's what came across, I apologize. That's
something I was thinking.
Yeah, that's not the idea. The idea is there's one piece of God. The piece of God is the same fundamentally through your whole life. It doesn't change. It's fundamentally the same. What can change are the very superficial garments, which that's obvious. I can change what I'm thinking about. I can change what I'm speaking about. And what can also change, although it's in an intermediate way, is the intellect and the emotions. The intellect and the emotions is not the deepest self, but it's not completely superficial, like thought, speech, and action. It's in the middle, right? On the one hand, it's really only just my way of relating, right? My intellect and my emotions do not ultimately define my godly soul. My godly soul is ultimately defined by being a piece of God and never changes. But my intellect and emotions are the profoundest and most fixed expression of my godly soul, which is why I'm saying that you could call them a self. That's what I'm talking about when I keep saying the self that is constructed through the intellect, right? Not the self in the sense of the soul that God created purely, per se. The soul that God created purely per se, unto itself, within itself, is literally just a piece of God, right? But there is a constructed self. There's a self that we build, right? It's part nature, it's part nurture, it's part effort. There's a self that we wear as an inner piece of clothing, right? More like, if the real metaphor is, right? So you have, if I had a whiteboard or something, this would be easier. I could draw the table for you, right? So I'd like you to think about it. You could think about it like this. You have the outer garments, thought, speech, and action, right, are like clothes. Yes? Clothes, you can change them, you could take them on, you could put them off. They're not part of you, right? They're things that you take on for a time, for a certain purpose, right? So that's literally like, the father comes home from work and he changes out of his work boots and he puts on his slippers, right? That's a superficial change. We change them in order to work with different situations. Different situations call for different shoes, right? It's very superficial. That's not a deep self-transformation. All I'm showing is that now I'm not at work, so I don't need the hard boots. I'd rather be comfortable. Now I'm at home, so I put on different shoes, right? Nothing mind-blowing there. The intellect and emotions, which are still like a garment, but a much deeper and much more fixed and much more unchanging garment, is actually like the physical body, right? It's actually like the body itself. The body itself is a garment. The body itself is a garment for the soul, right? The soul expresses itself through the body. And the body undergoes a lot of transformations from the time you're a baby, as you grow up and you become an adult and you go through different ages and different stages, right? There's all different changes that take place to the body. But even though the body is changing, and even though the body is physical, whereas the soul is much more spiritual, right? Even though the body is much more coarse than the soul is, yeah? Nevertheless, in a profound way, we feel the body to be ourselves, right? Because of the type of garment that it is, because it's such an expressive garment. And wherever the soul goes, wherever it's expressing itself, it has this garment, right? Now, this means, however, just because the soul always has the body, right? Just because the body is always there to help the soul express itself, doesn't mean that what the person is their body, God forbid.
It's amazing because it's related to our parasha.
Yeah.
It talks about Yitro, and it says it in a very different way. It's like 5 times the word Tov is mentioned up there.
Yeah.
And apparently, Moshe is asking Yitro, please do not go back to the desert, but stay with us because we need your blessing, your forget.
Yeah.
Apparently, when it says midbar, it's not talking about a midbar, it's talking about a medaber. And this is a conversation between the soul of, Moshe is like representing the soul of Yitro, and he's telling him, please convince your body to do that, because we're going to be it's like we're going to get advantages from the second world to come.
Right.
So it says, midbar is actually with the bear.
Right.
And so the goof is actually taking the destiny and the future of the soul, because if the body is not going to perform the way the soul wants it to perform, then the soul is going to lose.
Right.
So this is actually what you're saying.
Yeah. That exactly, the body has, as we're going to see as we keep going in Tanya, the body has its own plans, it has its own needs, which are not the same as the need of the soul. But fundamentally, why does the body exist? It exists so that the soul can interact with the world outside, right? This is exactly the same as the intellect and emotions. The intellect and emotions are like the spiritual body of the soul, so to speak, right? Just as it's a mashal, just as mashal, just as we have the physical body, which on the one hand is very closely related to the soul, but on the other hand is only a garment, is not the soul itself, and on the contrary, it has many things that the soul doesn't have. It has its own agenda, it has its own plan, etc., etc. So too, the intellect and emotions of the soul are not the soul itself, right? But on the other hand, they're very close and a very expressive garment of the soul. And really, they serve the same function as I was saying before. What's the function of the body? The function of the body is to make a person exist in a world where existing means external relation. If we just had Daryl's soul in this room, God forbid, we would say that as Daryl is no longer with us. That's what we say, right? If only Daryl's soul was in this room, we would say that unfortunately, God forbid, God preserve us, Daryl is no longer with us. I should use the example about myself, right? Would be a better example. I agree. The whole idea of being here, right, in our world terms, means being here in relation. We can see you. We can see that you're here. We can have an interaction with you, even though the soul, in a way, is much more real than the body. And the fact is, as it says later in Tanya, right, especially by tzaddikim, that when they pass away, their soul is even more in the world than it was before, right? Because their soul the presence of the soul has nothing to do with the body. Right? The body really doesn't determine where the soul is in any way. And on the contrary, when the tzaddik passes away, it's actually much more free. It's much more free to act in the world because it's not located and contained in one body. Sorry?
It could be shaped by the body.
Of course, the body has an effect on the soul. Of course, we're going to get into all of that in Tanya. That's a lot of what the discussion is about, right? There's an exchange. They affect each other. They interact and can affect each other. And how that interaction works is very important because that's where all the Avodas Hashem is, right? The whole point is to lift up and refine the body rather than letting the body control you. Yeah.
So that should not change no matter what.
The core of the Nefesh Elokis, yeah.
Okay.
Correct, it doesn't. But as you get into more external layers, into things like the garments of the Seichel HaMidos, of course, there can be an effect, right? In fact, that's we actually talked about that last week. We'll get to that in a moment.
Really? How does this play in now with the subconscious and the conscious?
Well, this is all the godly soul. So really, fundamentally, it doesn't really. Fundamentally, because we're talking about the godly soul. Most of what we normally call the subconscious, we really mean like the subconscious of the animal soul, more or less. So I'm not sure if really there's 100% a connection there. God willing, we'll talk about it more. We'll talk about it more in chapters like 6 and 7, God willing, when we get to the animal soul. God willing. What's the rush, right? You'll remember. You'll remember to bring it up. So, what we were discussing last week is that therefore, you have the intellect and the emotions, which are the self of the... Now we understand what we mean when we say that it's the self, right? The intellect is the soul creating itself. By itself, we mean something more like its body than actually it, right? Because obviously, if nothing creates itself, if it didn't already exist, how could it create itself, right? So even in the words, when I say that the seichel is how the soul constructs itself and builds itself, I don't mean the soul itself, the core of the soul, right? What I mean is, understand, I'm talking about the levushim, the garments. It's talking about the intellect, it's like it builds its own body, would be maybe a better way of saying it in the metaphor, right? The soul builds its own body. It builds its own way that it's going to exist and interact with the world. How does it build that self? Through a process called Chachma Bina Das. In the 3rd chapter of Tanya, we haven't yet spoken about Das. Das is actually at the end. Maybe we'll get there to today's class. We haven't talked about the 3rd emotional quality. But last week we were talking about the first 2, right? You have Chachma and Bina, right? And we were discussing last week how this is the process of the soul building itself. That the 2 of them together both give birth to the emotions, which in our metaphor you could really say that the emotions are the description of the shape of the body, right? So the process of building oneself, right, results in a body of a certain shape, which is the same way of saying the process of seichel results in midos of a certain quality, results in emotions being a certain way. And all of this, again, with the caveat, you have to remember that this isn't the way it works in a lot of our experience, because the way our intellect and emotions interact in day-to-day life is in the nefesh habahamis, is in the animal soul, which again we'll get to in chapter 6 and chapter 7. This is talking about the godly soul. In the godly soul, the way it works, or if you prefer, the way it's meant to work, right, is that emotions are born and shaped by the true intellectual understanding of something through Chachma and Bina, right? We have a lot of emotions that are not like that, or that don't seem to be like that. That's because we have a nefesh habahamis, which works in a different way. As we're going to see, the nefesh habahamis, even though it has an intellect and emotions, the way its intellect and emotions relate to each other is very different. The animal soul is primarily emotional, whereas the godly soul is primarily intellectual. And we'll discuss what that means as we get more into the differences in the later chapters. But the way the godly soul works is, as we discussed in this chapter, we said the godly soul perceives in Chachma that God is great, right? It sees the Gdulas Hashem, as we said last week. That's called Chachma. Chachma is seeing. The soul sees the truth of something. And of course, because the intellect is not external relation, but rather internal relationship with one's own source, when we are saying that the godly soul sees it with Chachma, we really mean that the godly soul sees this within itself. Where does it come from? What is it seeing? Not the greatness of God as some external thing or some idea in the world. The godly soul is not interested in the world, right? The godly soul is interested in God. And how does it know God? Because it is a piece of God, right? So it knows God not by going outside of itself, right? But by being what it is, by going inside of itself. So the process of Chachma, and the truth is that in Tanya, it doesn't really discuss that there's many more levels to the process that we get in much more detail in later Maimarim and in other places in Chassidus. In Tanya, it gives you the very basic process, right? That Chachma, it starts with Chachma, in other words. In other Maimarim, there's a lot of discussion, even Maimarim of Alter Rebbe, there's a lot of discussion of what comes before Chachma. There's something called the Hamaskil, which creates Chachma, and there's all sorts of interesting things in the soul before you get to Chachma, right? Here, we're talking about Chachma. Chachma means that the soul, wisdom, means the first faculty of the soul, the first aspect of the soul's body, so to speak, or the soul's way, what the soul does, what the soul is, right, is it has an ability to see the truth of God. Where does it see it? Where does it come from? The answer is really in itself. That's really where it sees it, right? We'll get into more of that maybe in some later chapters when we talk about emunah and faith and what that means and all of that sort of thing. But the bottom line, I just want you to know, because otherwise it can get confusing, because the way we've explained this whole chapter is that the emotions are the way that the soul relates to things outside of itself, right? So you could ask, but what do you mean? Isn't Chachma the soul relating to God? Something outside of itself, right? And the answer is no, it's different. The emotions are how the soul relates to God from the outside, so to speak, kaviyachol, right? How the soul relates to God. I'm the soul, you're God, and either I want to come closer to you with Ava, or I want to go further away from you and become Batal, which is Yira, right? But that's the external relation. Chachma, really, what Chachma really is in the godly soul is an internal relation. The soul doesn't see God as something outside of itself. It perceives godliness within what it is. It knows God because at a profound level it is God. And that's where Chachma comes from, the Chachma of the godly soul.
So the soul, they have Chachma, but Bina and that they should get during the time.
We're getting there. So so this is what the soul sees. And the Alter Rebbe says, the Alter Rebbe's example of what the soul sees is Gedulas Hashem, right? For example, the godly soul, of course, only sees godly things, right? It has no interest in, and possibly you could even say, I'm not 100% certain about this, you could possibly even say no means of even relating to it, doesn't even understand, right? Very similar to how the animal soul has no real understanding of God, the godly soul has no real understanding or appreciation for anything that's not God, right? It's the opposite. So its chachma is, it sees the greatness of God, as we said last week. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says, and then it contemplates the greatness of God, right? Which contemplation is bina, hisbenanos miloshan bina, right? Contemplation comes from the word bina, understanding, the second intellectual faculty. And when it brings the chachma into bina, what that means is it takes what it sees, right? But as we discussed last week, what it sees, even though it's very pure, even though it's very simple in a good way, simple like God is simple, right? Even though it's very simple, it's very direct, right? It's very pure, but unfortunately, simple, pure, direct knowledge of God cannot be used to build a full self, right? Because it's too simple.
But it stays the same during the whole life of a person?
What does?
I mean, that type of soul, the Chachma.
No. Of course not. Chachma and Bina change. Chachma and Bina grow, right? The fact that the godly soul has the connection with God from which the Chachma comes, that doesn't change. The quality of that connection, right? And it's each according to the person's level. So in other words, as we said in chapter 2, right? Some souls come from Atzilus, some souls come from Bria. So there's a certain quality to their direct connection to God. And that quality gives birth to different Chachmas according to their level, right? And the ability, and this is part of what is discussed in the other Maimarim, in the Alter Rebbe, this isn't really mentioned in Tanya at all, but I'll just tell you that elsewhere it discusses that when a person improves their chachma and refines their faculties, right? You can improve your ability to have chachma, etc., right? So the ability of what it's able to catch onto from what's coming from the godly soul, from what's coming from the essence, can be improved, right? Or worsened, God forbid, in the opposite direction, right? So the godly soul can begin to have higher chachmas, right? It's also connected to what we famously say in the Mishnah, right? In the Mishnah that discusses all the different ages, that a person's soul is able to appreciate different things as through the natural development of a lifespan, right? Like your 40 is connected with Bina, for example, right? When you're 40, you really start to understand. It says in the Pirkei Avos, right? So what that means is that the soul has reached a certain maturity where it has a better grasp on this sort of thing. So this sort of thing does change, right?
And it has limitation, because if you're coming from brilliant and you have a certain limitation, if you're coming from...
Yeah, exactly. Each one has its own limitation. However, as we did discuss last time, and this is why it's so important, you see now, maybe in light of this, why this point was so important in chapter 2, it doesn't matter how low it gets, it's still literally a part of God, right? There's no Jewish godly soul that's not a piece of God. The way it comes down just has to do with the way that connection manifests, the way it expresses itself, the level it expresses itself. But everyone has that connection, which means every godly soul, right, at some level can have this chachma. Every godly soul can look into itself and see the greatness of God, right? Then it brings it into Bina. Bina takes that thing which is only a nakuda, which is only a point, the greatness of God, the pure thing that it sees, and now it's going to transform it and allow that to become the basis for a self, a full self that's separate from Hashem, or that's a separate from Hashem is a strong term. That's a full self that can interact with Hashem as its own being, right? Something that can interact. Because if you only have Chachma, as we discussed last week, if you only have the direct perception of the reality of Hashem, right, that cannot create an emotional being with finite and created emotions and ways of relating to other things. Or a different way of putting this is, if all there was Chachma, there would really be no godly soul aside from being a part of Hashem, right? What makes it a full soul with all of its different faculties, right? That it's able to go into the world and interact with the animal soul and transform the world and do mitzvahs and study Torah and all these things. What allows it to do that is that it has all of its faculties, that it has Ava and Yira, as we're going to get to, it has Netzach and Hod. It needs the full range of ways of interacting. It needs an interface. That's the word. It needs an interface with the world, with the animal soul, with things outside of itself, right? And if it only had Chachma, there would be no interface, because all it would have is, wow, look at the greatness of God in its purest form, right? Which is not a self. That's just a perception of God. There's no full self there. You can't bring that down to the animal soul. You can't use that purely to do mitzvahs and to do Torah, right? So in other words, if the godly soul remained up in heaven and never had to come down to this world and never had to have any interaction with anything outside of itself, maybe you could stop at Chachma. Maybe, right? Maybe it would only need Chachma, because all it really needs is knowing itself, and through that knowing God. But because that's not the mission of the godly soul, because the godly soul is created as a full being that needs to interact with and interface with Elam Haza Hagashmi, the physical world, physical tangible reality, and also with the Nefesh HaBahami V'Achumri V'Ativi, and also with the animals, the natural animal material soul, right? Therefore, it has to have a full self. So that's why the soul is given a capacity by Hashem called Bina. Bina takes the greatness of Hashem, like the mashal of the Mittler Rebbe that we keep saying in every class, the mashal of the son of the Alter Rebbe, his metaphor, Chachma versus Bina, is like the one drop that comes out of the wellspring versus the whole river, right? The drop in the wellspring is Chachma, the drop in the Mayan is the Chachma, the one drop of water. That's how it comes out of the earth. You can trace this whole big river all the way back, and you'll see that the way it comes out of the earth is in a very, very small, like it looks like one drop at a time, right? That's the wellspring, that's Chachma. The river, which has its dimensionality, it's 3D, as the Mittler Rebbe explains at length. It has Erech, V'Reichev, the Omek, which the Mittler Rebbe explains what all of these things are. Al Pi Chassidus, he explains what does it mean Erech, what does it mean Reichev, what does it mean Omek, right? It has dimensionality. It's a 3D thing. It has a full structure. It becomes a solid reality. So we gave the example of this in Tanya. What does it look like when the Gedulas Hashem comes into Bina? So we explained, Bina, which is all about analysis and appreciation, right, takes this vision of the greatness of Hashem, And it won't leave it alone, because that's what Bina is. Bina is, no, but we have to understand what is the greatness of Hashem. What are all of its parts? What are all of its levels? How do they interact? How do they work together, right? And that's why we say Bina doesn't just have the greatness of Hashem. The greatness of Hashem is Chachma. Bina there's a contemplation for Mamale Kolamin. There's a contemplation for the greatness of God as godliness enters the world and becomes the finite reality of everything that exists in our universe, right? Which is, as we mentioned last week, each one of these categories has within it a million things, maybe infinite things that you could really contemplate, right? But it's a category. One category is Mamale Kolam. You contemplate God as he enters into godliness, as it's contracted and becomes immanent and finite and within limited realities. Then there's a hisbeinenus for Sevev. There's a hisbeinenus for God that is not nature, God beyond nature, God beyond the nature of things, God of miracles, God who creates the universe ex nihilo, creates the universe yesh ma'ayin, something from nothing. And then finally you also have a contemplation of kula kamei kulei chashiv, which is that even beyond Sevev, even beyond God who is beyond nature, there is the God before whom all of the worlds are absolutely as nothing, right? Who's totally beyond the universe and all the finite worlds and all the things we know, the utterly transcendent one God, that kula kamei kulei chashiv, everything before him is as nothing. And all of this is in Bina, right? In Chachma, it's just Gedulas Hashem. I see the greatness of God. There may not even be words for it, right? It's something that you see. Some things you see you can't describe, right? So the soul sees in Chachma the greatness of God, whatever that means. It sees this vision directly, as it were. And then in Bina, it's no, but there's lots of different aspects to the greatness of God. Explain to me the greatness of God. And you say, well, okay, there's three different general types. There's the greatness as it's in Mamale. There's the greatness as you relate to it in Sevev, a totally different way of relating to God's greatness. And then there's the greatness of God you relate to in Kula Kamei Kulei Chashiv, right? And all of this, of course, each one of these are hundreds and hundreds of pages of Maimarim, right? And you can go, you can find them, you can contemplate on each one, on each level, on each thing, right? That's Bina. Bina is that the soul takes that nakuda, takes that point, that single point of the greatness of God, and turns it into something that can be appreciated in each of its ways. And then we explained last week and what happens when it comes into Bina. And the person contemplates it at length and at depth, right? The person really, the soul, the godly soul, really contemplates all the different aspects of the greatness of God. What is born from this Bina first, so then what happens is something called Yira.
But it requires action from the person to do that. It's not a process that is going to be initiated by itself.
Yes, and therefore, I'm sensing the question. Tell me, what's the question?
Therefore, what if the person doesn't do it? It's like you need to practice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting point. I think maybe we'll discuss it more next chapter, but what I'm hearing is, I think what the question really is like, we're describing this as something which happens in order, but the truth is that the soul really already has thought, speech, and action before all of this starts, because if it doesn't have the ability to think, how can it be mizbenin, right? In other words, it's like the end of the process has to happen before the beginning of the process happens, right?
There's potential, there's action.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Right. What I'm saying is that in the way we've been describing all of this today, right, is that it's all by what happened there. Then you get to the outer garments of thought, speech, and action, which are affected by and are created by these higher faculties, right? But really, the point you're making is that none of this happened unless the person acts, right? The person has to do it. It's not something that happens by itself, so to speak, right? Which is a very interesting point. So God willing, maybe when we get to the garments, the chapter on garments, which is starting chapter 4, hopefully we'll explain this a bit more about how the idea that even though Chachma and Bina are what eventually build Maisa, in a way, it starts at the end and goes the other direction as well. There has to be a Maisa which precedes even the Chachma and Bina, right? There's something very profound about that. I think in Chassidus sometimes we would call that thing Kabbalah's O, in a very often, right? There's an action that has to precede even the highest thought, but We'll get to that. Okay.
It's like a cascade.
Yes, it's a cascade, but it runs in both directions. That's what's confusing about it. It's a cascade that goes down, but at the same time, it goes down also comes up. Yeah, there's or Yashar or Chayzer. There's the whole Chassidus. This is a whole Megillah. Yes, you were going to say?
I got another question.
Yeah, please.
The godly soul.
Yeah.
Is that downloaded once, like when you're born, and then you operate with that from there on?
Yes. Yes, it's down. It's actually down. It actually starts to be downloaded. It actually starts to be downloaded at the bris, and the full downloading is finished at the bar mitzvah, which is actually something we'll discuss, God willing, next week.
Even age of 20.
Yeah, 20 for the higher levels of the neshama, kaser, and all these things.
There's a maintenance plan.
There's a whole. You get this double before.
It's a what's it called? It's software as a service. You have to maintain your subscription, right? It's not a one-time download. You have to keep paying, right? So it's like Spotify. You're only streaming. It's only a rental, right?
Make sure the company is in business.
Yeah. Make sure, keep us out of bankruptcy. Exactly. Good point. So from Bina, the way the process goes is, as we discussed last week, it looks like most of this class is going to end up being review, which is okay. As we discussed last week, what happens after Bina is there's something called Yira, right? Which Yira, interestingly, a lot of the time when we talk about Yira in Chassidus, we actually mean an emotion. We mean a midah, right? Associated with Gevura. There's an emotion called Yira. However, here in Tanya, it's clear from the context that what the Alter Rebbe means by Yira here, as opposed to Pachad is going to be the emotion. Yira is actually intellectual here, right? What happens is like this, and this is discussed in many places in Chassidus when it talks about practical Avodah, like how this whole system is actually supposed to work, right? You have the Chachma, you have the Bina, right? You're contemplating this aspect of godliness, right? There's a lot more to this as well for a different time. This is a whole thing that we're leaving out. But what happens when you do this properly, bottom line, is that, and we're leaving out the animal soul as well entirely, so that's also a whole other thing that's left out. So when you do this properly, assuming it's just in the Nefesh Elokis, right? Very simply, when Bina is working properly, and you're contemplating the greatness of God in all of its different aspects, because that's what Bina is, right? What happens is that what's born is an intellectual emotion. It's not an emotion. It's an emotion of the intellect. What does that mean? It means that the person comes to a conclusion, and the way this happens is being intentionally obscured right now. We're not going to talk about it, right? About how this happens exactly. But the person comes to a conclusion in their bina, in their deliberation, in their contemplation, in their appreciation of godliness. A person comes to the conclusion that really, theoretically, I understand that it's absolutely true that I'm nothing before Hashem, right? That's Yira. That's Yira. It's theoretical. In other words, I'm not even relating to it really as a practical thing. It's not really real yet in the sense of no, this is actually the reality, right? When it's in the mind, it's still abstract because the mind thinks abstractly, right? So in the mind, it says, if it were the case, right, that God is so great in Mamale and great in Sevev and great in Kula Kamei Kolei Chashiv, if that were the case, what that would really mean is that I'm nothing before God, or I would be nothing before God if that were the case, right? If that were true, I would be nothing before God. That's called Yira. Yeah. Then in between, and it's interesting how the Alter Rebbe arranges the chapter, because this, as we're going to see, he only talks about at the end of chapter 3. Then there's something called Das, which is the third intellectual faculty. Das takes this Yira, right? And it says it's the soul's ability to realize that this is actually the case. Which is a very mysterious thing, by the way, that I to this day don't fully understand what that means exactly, right? The soul has a fundamental ability to go from if this were the case, this would be how I feel about it. 2, oh, it actually is the case. Like this is real. This is not a discussion. This is not theoretical, right? That's called das, as we're going to see at the end of the chapter. That's what the faculty of dat is. Das is, as we discussed in earlier classes about the 10 faculties, das is the uniting of universes, right? The two things which seemed separate, right? There's reality, there's me, there's the one who's thinking about God, and then there's the God I'm thinking about, right? Das is, wait a second, these two things, they occupy one space. These two things are in one universe. God is as real, the God you're thinking about is as real as the one who's thinking about it. That's das.
It's actually a practical thing.
Absolutely. That's the point of everything. Das is fundamental. It's extremely important, right? In Chassidus it explains, we'll talk about this more, God willing, by the end of the chapter. In Chassidus it explains that the klippa that's against das, the force of negativity that is against das, is pareh, is Pharaoh, right? Because it always says in the Maimarim that pareh, Pharaoh, is osias ha'eref. Pareh is the same letters as ha'eref, which means the back of the neck, right? Which means, where does he sit? He sits right between your head and your heart, right back here, right? And Pareh says, it doesn't matter what you tell me about God, I don't care. Right? It's apathy. It's apathy. Pareh is apathy, numbness.
They have heard that actually Pharaoh returning tshuva.
Yeah. I've heard a similar thing. Yeah, that Pareh eventually did tshuva. Yeah.
And said, I believe in God.
Yeah. I've heard that as well. But it took a lot of breaking first before that happened.
So is das, in a sense, the uniting of the two?
The uniting of Chachma and Bina?
More.
The uniting of God and the soul? Yeah.
Well, God and the soul, or the soul with the physical with the non-physical?
It's a very loaded question. I can't answer the question. The question is, there's too much. The truth is that all things that are united by das, in some sense, right? I'll give you the mystical answer that doesn't really explain anything by itself. The mystical answer that doesn't explain anything by itself is that in Chassidus there's das between everything. Everything that's united, that shares a space, that shares a reality, it's united by das. Yeah? Das is very special. All the spheres that are in the middle, on the middle row in that picture, right, are very godly. They're especially divine, right? And das is one of them. Anyway, let's just at least finish there. We didn't do anything but review in this class, but let's at least finish the review, yeah? The das takes this and says, oh, the God who I was saying, if this is the reality about God, then I would be nothing. It says, oh, wow, oh no, wait a second. That is the reality of God. That is real, right? That's the reality. The God I'm thinking about is as real as the one who's thinking about it. Yeah? This gives birth to something called pachad. This gives birth to emotional fear. Emotional fear, right? Which manifests, the yira manifests as a profound sense of bittul, right? Pachad is an emotion. Pachad comes and it actually has an emotion that the heart could appreciate theoretically, right? Pachad is the emotion of what we normally call fear of God, which in general, fear means I want to keep my distance, right? Awe, respect, right? I don't want him to see me. I don't want to be in his presence because I can't handle it, right? It's too great, it's too big, right? That's the fear of God, so to speak. That's pachad. Yeah. So the emotional fear is now the self that has been constructed, right? The Chachma Bina Das process is a process of the soul building itself, of building its own body, right? It went from, this is the deepest truth of my reality that I see, which is Chachma. Yeah, Chachma is I see this as the deepest truth of myself, which is the greatness of God in the godly soul. Then it goes on to Bina, and Bina says that thing which is the deepest truth of myself can actually be built out into something finite and substantial and dimensional and tangible, right? With all of these different details about this greatness of God, that greatness of God. I've taken something that was basically, as described in Chassidus, I've taken nothing and made it into something. Is going from Chachma to Bina, right? I was nothing. I was simply a direct perception of God in Chachma. Then I make that into something. I make that into, now I'm a being who has thoughts about God, who has contemplations about God. I relate to Male or Sevev or Kula Kamei Kalei Chashiv, and I relate to them in different ways on different levels, right? That self, which is then created in Bina, gives birth to something called Yira, which is the intellectual emotion, which is the source of the emotion that's then going to be born, the actual emotion, right? And Das says this is actually real. And when Das comes and says that this thing is actually real, that you and the thing that you're contemplating are in one reality, you're connected with it, yeah? What that does is cause an emotion. What that does is now you can have an emotional relationship with God, that I actually feel a sense of fear from God, because God has gone from being something abstract to being something real. It's in the same reality as me, right? The quality of my fear of God is determined, therefore, if you trace it all the way back, by the quality of my hisbonenus, right? You see the connection? This is what I mean when I say,
like a chain reaction.
Yes,
But I don't
yes.
think we need to call it fear, it's also respect.
Yeah, respect. We can translate it different ways. We can discuss it. I agree, but it is a chain reaction. That's exactly right. It's cause and effect, one to the next to the next. So what this means is, as the Alter Rebbe is going to say, and in a way this is one of the most important practical ramifications, is that by controlling your thoughts, you can control everything, right? Through an organic process, not directly, right? But by changing the way you think, eventually it gives birth to different emotions, right? So now I want you to take this whole review that we've done and plug it into what I said at the beginning. At the beginning I said, Seichel is the soul building itself, right? Midos, emotions, the intellect is the soul building itself. Midos and emotions are the self that the soul uses in external relation, right? How it relates to things outside of itself. In this process, I want you to see how that works, right? The soul has no self to start with. It's literally one with God. Yeah, it becomes a defined self through the process of Chachma and Bina, because once it's through Bina, it has now become a contemplator. It is a defined self. It has a being separate from God, right? There's God. But now there's a thing that contemplates and appreciates different aspects of God, right? That's a self. There's God, and there's a God appreciator once you get through Bina, right? It's building itself. And Das, right? Das says this self can actually now go and interact with the thing that built it. It can go and interact with God, right? Das lets the soul turn this self that it's built outward to now go actually have a relationship with God. And the emotion, pachad, right? The actual experience of fear of God, practically speaking, as an emotion, is the way that this self has been built to react to God. This self has been constructed, the soul, because the soul said, I'm a God appreciator who appreciates Mamale and Sevev and Kula Kamei Kalei Chashiv, that eventually creates the quality of the emotions, right? Because all the emotion is the way this self now is going to actually go and interact with God as an outside thing, in an external relationship, right? So now that I've built this self in Bina, right? Now that I've built this self through contemplation, that self, now when it sees God, it feels like it's nothing. It feels like it's bottle. It feels like it's absolutely nothing before God as an emotion, not an idea, right? It comes down from an idea, from a state of intellectual bittul, down into an emotion, and that which is an actual feeling, right? So that now, even though it's a feeling and it's separate from Hashem and it's relating to Hashem as an external thing, right? How does it relate? It relates with pachad that is born from yira, which is defined by and shaped by the quality of the hisbonenus, right? So that's the process that the Alter Rebbe described here. That's what we did last week. Next week, God willing, we'll finish up and talk a little bit about ava, because this was all about yira. Next week, we're going to talk about love of God, and then we're going to go straight from there and talk about das, and God willing, finish the chapter. All right. Have a good one.